I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today, I'm speaking with John Cheney-Lippold about his book, We Are Data: Algorithms and the Making of Our Digital Selves. Let me just say, I think this is a really important book for anyone trying to understand how we fit within the 21st century technological landscape. And like all of my guests, John has graciously given 5 book recommendations that you can check out at tinapp.org. Should also be in the show notes, so if you want to check that out, see what he's reading and what he thinks you might want to read as well, I highly recommend checking out any of the reading recommendations of any of my guests. While you're there, if you want to give a good review or what have you, I appreciate that as well. So John, thanks very much for being on the show today. I wanted to start with a question that occurred to me when I was looking at the cover of your book. I now look at publishers' catalogs and think about what books I'm interested in reading, and then maybe sometimes who I'm interested in talking to. And I'm sure that you can identify with this. There are a lot of books on data, algorithms, digital culture, digital life, and stuff like that. At this point in our sort of culture and in our scholarship, I kind of get wary seeing this stuff because I worry that, oh, this is something that I've heard before. It's not going to be that new. And of course, I was really happy to read your book, and I think it does offer a lot of new and insightful things. How do you find reading books or reading material on data, algorithms, and that kind of thing today? Are you oversaturated, or how do you feel?
I think that we can even maybe identify like a 3-stage process by which any new technology or cultural phenomena that deals with the newness is approached. And usually it's the first people, like in my case, it's people in the mid-90s, like Nicholas Negroponte, in being digital, saying, oh, the world will be tailorized to us, will be, personalized, everything, the mass media will go away, and that the specificity of the individual self, reifying kind of liberal humanist tropes, will be attended to in the most perfect, possible way. And so that's that first thing. And so for me, a lot of those texts are really useful because they set up the straw man arguments by which you can kind of like disabuse yourself immediately of. I'm thinking also about Sherry Turkle's Life on the Screen, but a lot of the cyber utopian stuff, the mid-90s. And then you get in the mid-2000s and late 2010s or early 2010s, you get these really interesting texts delving into why those cyber utopian philosophies maybe now don't really pan out, or if they do pan out a little bit, how they could be corralled by good critical theory or just good critical thinking. And then you have books, I'll include in terms of the timing of this, when my book came out, you have books that are like looking at it after the fact and trying to think through it as a process of, this happened, but how we can improve on it. And so there's less of a critical edge, or if there is, it's kind of a very narrow parochial critical edge. And so for my book, I was obviously book writing takes a lot of time. And so for me, I was straddling that critical as well as maybe prophetic or theorizing kind of the future way of what went wrong in the 90s, what could we improve on 2010s, and then how could we come out of it? So for me, a lot of the ideas of writing the book to make it different from the maybe just parochial sense is to think about it more longitudinally. So in my work, I'm actually using examples from 2000s to 2016. I think that's the last example I used in the text. And for me, I'm then trying to draw it across a lot of different registers and talking about different instances of technology as well as just different ways that technology often ruins lives. Or if it doesn't ruin life, it challenges life in a very distinct digital form. And so part of this, to go to the cover, or if you're referencing the cover, is that I had this really fun engagement with the press and with NYU Press. And I had, from the entire time, said, I don't want any ones and zeros on the book. I don't want anything that, fetishizes the digital in this very 1990s or even early 2000s way. And so even up to the last moment, and this is no slight on them, but they tried to sneak a 1 and a 0 on the book flaps. And so I guess the only creative authorship you really have as a first-time author with the academic world usually is, just saying yes or please no. But I was able to say, luckily, no to that and got it off. Because I do think it makes it the book We Are Data as a title might, make you feel like, oh, it's just the same argument that's been rehashed over and over and over. But for me, it's trying to think of, and I think actually the cover does as well, like, if you haven't seen the cover, people listening, it's a bunch of an artist from Europe who did this really amazing painting on old floppy disks. And so it has this longitudinal approach to it, but the actual person that is painted on it looks from the future. It looks a person who doesn't necessarily conform to extant stereotypes or doesn't necessarily conform to how we understand people. And I do think that that's, the newness of technology can allow anormative or potentially disruptive identities or disruptive aesthetics. And so there's something there that I really want to celebrate. But also I just think it's a fantastic cover. So to compliment my own book, I guess is a weird thing. But nonetheless, I'm very fond of it because obviously it's not my work.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, actually. I didn't realize that. So it's sort of a canvas of discs. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. You can even see on this might be a deep dive. If you go into it, like there's even when it's whited out to make the canvas, you can still see the the metal gate.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at it now, and I thought originally that it was sort of photoshopped on a person, sort of like a silhouette, and you can see these old school discs. But now that you say that, yeah, I see that it's actually a sort of canvas that's been painted on, which is even cooler. But yeah, so continuing with that a little bit, people talking about computers either early on being sort of utopian or later being sort of dystopian. There's a lot of people who feel strongly about data algorithms and the digital world today. How did you come to start to weigh in and to find your own position, considering that sort of huge landscape of people writing about this? How did you find your sort of niche or figure out where you fit?
Yeah. I think I can begin with my initial research question was, why was Google buying all of these companies that had nothing necessarily to do with what Google wanted to do or what it said it was going to do in terms of especially search? And so this is, the mid-aughts, and thinking about, well, this is a company for like DoubleClick, which I mentioned in the book, or this is YouTube or whatever. And obviously there's a monopolistic tendency to it. But I was also doing a lot of work on macroeconomic theory and thinking of how just kind of nation states themselves would develop certain, industries within their own boundaries. And so concepts like what's called agglomeration, which is the reduction of transport costs across different firms in order to then produce a monolithic kind of inertia then to make the price of the product that company's making cheaper and thus to undersell everybody else and then dominate the market. And so I thought, well, what would happen if that was what Google was doing? And reducing, instead of transport costs of metal and other, raw materials, it was data before, the proprietary ways that, Yahoo had one piece of data, another company had another piece of data, another company, another piece of data. So by seeing this crazy agglomeration of data, I saw extraordinary use both for good and for bad. And in terms of Google's sense, it was very much for, profiling and marketing. And so I saw that about 2006 and 2007 when I eventually bought DoubleClick. And so I tried to follow that, and I eventually got to the idea of identity, not through cultural studies, which was a focus of my graduate work, but it was actually through an economics approach to understand how these forces were producing monopolies.
Well, and then so in terms of constructing the self and rethinking that, we are data, I think, can be explored. The idea that we are data can be explored in a number of ways, as you do in the book. Thinking back onto earlier cultural studies, you reference sort of a lot of people that I'm really interested in and that I use a lot to think through. Foucault, Deleuze, Judith Butler, these kinds of people who are interested also in identity. Sometimes they do it, especially I'm thinking of Butler, in a sort of a celebratory way where, you can make what you want out of your identity to a certain extent. Other times it's sort of scary, the control society and these kinds of ideas. How would you explain identity as we become data, especially for anyone who hasn't read the book yet? Is it a scary outlook for you? Is it a potentially liberating outlook? Can you say a little bit about how you feel?
Yeah, I think without a qualifier, an identity made from data can be quite liberatory. The issue I run into is often when that data is proprietary or classified, or you don't have access to it and you don't know what it means, or for lack of a better word, when it's not social and it's private, that's when identity for me becomes very problematic, when it's made through data. And so a lot of the ways I was thinking through the book is I'm pinging off of a lot of texts from before, such as people like Mark Andrejevic or Greg Elmer, and work on profiling. I'm thinking about how profiling has always more or less been with the datafied world. But my question was not about how individuals are profiled, but the knowledges that make identity. So to think about somebody like Butler, we perform and thus collectively create and challenge extant or nascent identity categories through just daily actions, mundane whateverness. But what we're seeing is that has some sort of volition or some sort of reflexivity, where, and I'm especially fond of an early Jack Halberstam article that talks about gender being algorithmic, that it's this feedback loop that's constantly assessing and reassessing. But unlike a world where you feel in the Foucauldian form some sort of hardline limit that says you stepped over a line, or I'm going to give you shade because you don't fit within the internal box I'm trying to put you in, that necessarily reverberates around society. The datafied identity I'm trying to think about is when that identity is proprietary and used for prediction, where there's no reason for them to care about gender in the patriarchal form, even though that patriarchal form of gender bleeds into this datafied gender. But it's trying to find and control in the Deleuzian form how people work, how people manage themselves. And thus identity stops being a thing that you figure out through behavior, but is instead something that is trailing after you constantly in order to predict in the future. So in this way that we think of, especially debates about identity politics, a lot of the claims about identity in the offline or even digital world that isn't mediated through algorithms, they don't make sense in a datafied algorithmic world. And I'm thinking in the book, I use several examples, one of which is friends of mine who are identified as different genders. Me, myself, I'm identified as a different gender. I even found out after the book was published that Facebook has something called ethnic affinity, which takes the pages that you've liked on your Facebook account and tries to assign not your ethnicity, but your affinity for an ethnicity. And obviously it's very white supremacist because whiteness doesn't exist within the ethnic drop-down menu that they have. But the way I was identified was as a Hispanic. And I'm a white Danish guy, so there's not necessarily anything Hispanic about me in terms of ethnicity, but it was predictively useful because maybe I do like tango music or I do like Argentine football. And so the notion of what identity is, or especially something like ethnicity, this is something very specific, culturally, historically situated, and shared across, generations, not something that's algorithmically determined. And so my fear is that things like ethnicity will become algorithmic ethnicity or ethnic affinity in the Facebook sense will become more and more powerful and will actually disrupt how we understand ethnicity in a social historical form. So instead of being I identify as X, I'm identified as Y.
Well, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I was going to ask you next, is that you mentioned, I think there was an article, Who Does Google Think You Are?, that anyone can still Google, although it's a little bit dated now, or I don't know. The scary thing, I guess, is that I did this. I looked it up right after I was reading your book, and I realized that Google had me perfect, which I was surprised at. But then I realized it's also because I was logged in and I've at some point filled in most of this information myself. So it should be perfect, which I don't know if that's scarier or less scary. But I want to ask you, so you found that they thought you were, what was it, an older woman?
65-year-old woman.
65-year-old woman, yeah. As you mentioned, this can be predictive in terms of what you're going to search for, who might want to market to you. So in some sense, if you have, for some reason, the characteristics of a 65-year-old woman, advertisers may want to, obviously not in every case, but in some cases, you would fit that profile, and therefore it would be beneficial to advertise to you because you've somehow fallen in line with this. But it does remove whatever we might have originally offline thought about gender and age and other characteristics. Is that what you think we're moving towards, is that maybe we change or maybe we don't change the signifier, but the idea of gender, age, and all these other things online are going to be just unrelated to what we used to think of them?
Yeah, or if they're not unrelated, they're epiphenomenally related. Obviously, the offline world bleeds into the digital very, very, very easily and oppressively. But it's to say, that we used to be able to say that there was a there, even performance studies and, identity as a performance itself, that there's some sort of there that you can point to. And if it's materially practiced through action, or if it's, assigned through population level analytics, that there's something you can point to and say that is a gender. Part of what I'm really fond of is how marketers, and I'm thinking in the 1970s especially, that marketers were very keen on what became now as like neoliberal intersectionality. So unlike the, especially Black feminist theorists or even folks in the early 20th century who were trying to think about the complexities of race, class, gender, that marketers were finding out that they were losing money because they were trying to identify people according to either woman or man, or either, 65 or 18. And so these hard-coded categories weren't making them that much money because you're wasting a lot of advertising revenue on things that potentially, not all men are like X. And so they were figuring out, well, how do we narrow these categories down through what we could call as an intersectional approach, quite, crassly, let's just say. And so they were thinking about this in the 70s and trying to figure out, these categories of identity make sense only as much as they help us get money. And so they started to make new identities. This is the introduction of psychographics that were then used in Cambridge Analytica scandals. But there are these new foundations of knowledge because these knowledges are not trying to treat people as humans with the politics of identity wrapped in their bodies, but trying to think about them as as potential consumers, or in the perfect media studies ways, as just eyeballs. And how can you understand the eyeball best? And that's often not through the crass senses of either gender or race. It is the intersection of all those. But then even if you move that logic further, often race as a social construct doesn't necessarily contain the entirety of one's experience, right? And so if you created new categories that often didn't have the stain of injustice on them, or they didn't have the stain of oppression and historical legacies of whatever in it, that you could actually produce extraordinarily effective clustering models of how people behave. And so in one chapter of the book, I talk about these Twitter researchers who had referencing you earlier, just read Judith Butler and realized identity wasn't this essential thing. They found out actually most machine learning models that are supervised rely on this sense of essential, either you are a man or either you are a woman. So they train data sets accordingly, men do this, women do that, and then they create models of what those people do in aggregate. So they said, what if we don't create supervision? What if we just create a completely unsupervised algorithm that's just trying to find patterns or clusters of identity? And so these authors of this algorithm were able to very adeptly find 20 different clusters of unique identities that had nothing necessarily to do with gender, race, class, sexuality, age, whatever, but had a lot to do with just the profiling of certain kinds of people, behaviorally operating in certain ways that could then lead to, higher yields of marketing dollars. You could assign race or class or gender onto these based on what are the actual words that people type or how they might speak, but it is nonetheless something that doesn't have those things a priori, that you have to ascribe them after the fact. Interestingly enough, the categories are just C1 through C20. They don't try to make any fanciful name about it or even connect it to offline identity. It's just these new forms of epistemic digitality we might think of.
I mean, I found that really interesting because I think in the best case scenario, let's say there was a large enough group of people that could say whatever you're going to call it, like C1, for example, that's going to involve not anything based on gender or race or even potentially income, but instead it's going to be about people who are, let's say, interested in social justice and who are frequent callers to Congress and who are frequently, reading news and becoming opinion leaders and stuff like that. So then C1 could be literally a group of people who their shared characteristic, rather than race or sex or anything like that, is, let's say, a deep concern for social justice. So to me, that seems nice, sort of. But then there's also, of course, some downsides to this kind of thing. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more on this kind of potential of moving away, at least algorithmically, from the traditional markers of gender, race, and class and such, and towards these kinds of sort of updated 21st century psychodemographics.
Yeah, so I think the idea of social justice is fantastic because it wouldn't necessarily be that they are social justice people or they actually care about it. It's that they would use words like woke or use words like race, class, gender, words like justice or oppression. Mm-hmm. And so obviously that doesn't mean that you're an anti-racist activist if you use words like woke or talking about race a bunch. But nonetheless, it does have that potential implication you could read into it. I think the interesting thing, too, would be that a lot of these marketing companies are not wanting to deal with these very thorny issues. They would rather it just be C1 because then you can't be accused of, as Facebook was with their ethnic affinity, of racial redlining or ethnic redlining. Or in the case with Facebook is that people were deselecting some ethnic groups from rental properties or from job opportunities. And obviously that's illegal based on anti-discrimination law in the US. But there's an argument to be made that Facebook, I believe, did, that they said that we're not dealing with ethnicity, we're dealing for affinity for ethnicity. As it become more maybe aligned away from the big three, race, class, gender in their, white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalistic forms, we are still residing in the world of identity that have those inflections. But instead of being able to say, well, that's a racial injustice, we kind of have to gauge maybe that's a racial injustice, maybe that's haphazard, maybe that's just an accidental algorithmic output, or maybe that is, implicit white supremacy and all training data actually coming to fruition in how an algorithmic output is actually processed. The larger question, though, I think is really, really interesting because it does, and a lot of people have been very, very interested in this precisely for this reason, that it has a liberatory aspect. It allows us a way out of the essentialism that is often replete within a lot of identity politics discourse. But at the same time, much like post-colonial theorists talked about ideas of strategic essentialism or just talked about how intersectionality itself is an important tool, it's precisely because these things still matter. And I feel when we move away from them in terms of language, that we're unable to then point our finger on it. And instead we have to kind of look through the one-way mirror of an algorithmic output, or even trying to think about machine learning models that people who write them don't necessarily know how they produce something or what the output is. So the complexity within these models, obviously, baked in are injustices, but outputted are not necessarily anything that is explicit and political, because it just seemed to be a mash. And there's a lot of really interesting work, obviously, Virginia Eubanks, Sophia Noble, doing very, very good work on this phenomenon. I'm interested in how new knowledge is also, without necessarily being explicitly racialized or explicitly gender, explicitly classed, how they nonetheless can reiterate or reify these X and asymmetries. While keeping in mind, and I'm not trying to be a cynic, I do think that there's a really lovely possibility of finding solidarities across difference that maybe we didn't know because we were lodged within 20th and even 19th century versions of how the world and how we are identified, that we could potentially in the 21st century find these associations that might be really fruitful, but just we have to algorithmically confer them before we understand that they're there.
Well, I mean, just to sort of reiterate, I think some of the things that you were saying, it seems like there is potentially a way out of a lot of the current sort of social injustice right now based on historical practices. But it also seems like there's quite an easy potential for not talking about this to become a sort of modern form of colorblindness, where I don't see race and so therefore I can't be a racist and therefore I'm going to continue in white supremacist practices, but I'm not going to call it that. Mm-hmm. On one level, it seems like you could erase all of this difference in the sense that you're just not going to speak about it again. But on another level, you could erase it, or maybe you could erase it to a degree that actually leads to less bias and less disenfranchisement. But I mean, I'm not asking you to predict the future or to say like where this will go, but maybe you could say a little bit about how to weigh those things when you're looking at new technologies, because as you said, you have a few years of technology that you're looking at in this book, but I'm sure that you're keeping up to date, and then perhaps in further work or in other work, you'll continue to think about this kind of thing. So how do you start to think about it when you're, let's say, when you're presented with something like a Facebook or Google algorithm that may in some sense lead to more liberating practices of getting rid of previous biases, or may be masking actually much more deep-seated and therefore perhaps more problematic biases? How do you start to weigh those ideas?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, a lot of the, as people probably are familiar, a lot of the logics of Silicon Valley are trying desperately to avoid humanity, desperately avoid the idea of human touch that could then potentially be, racist or classist or sexist. I'm thinking especially about an algorithm that Amazon had for its hiring procedures, and it was lambasted. It was several months ago that it came out that it was, a very sexist algorithm. And it's kind of unsurprising to assume, oh, well, yeah, of course it's going to be sexist because it comes from sexist training data or comes from a very sexist or at least, masculine dominated Silicon Valley culture or Amazon culture too. But they found out that the hiring algorithm was less sexist than a human. And ostensibly, we're talking about white masculinity and the hiring procedures. And so there's something very interesting in that, in as much as we can say, yeah, there are potentials for degrees of less discrimination when we think about using maybe technologies to avoid humanity's touch. I would think, though, that they're in that interpretation, they're very much using the idea of humanity as a catch-all for a very singular group, people who already have power in Silicon Valley or at Amazon, often, again, white masculine people, but also just people who are invested within the extant structures of an Amazon. So, cultural processes of hiring, then just returning over and over and over the same kind of candidates. So there's a call, obviously, that's really necessary for diversity in these processes that could potentially be even better than this less sexist than normal hiring algorithm. So I'm wary of using technology as a catch-all precisely because there's always a desire to remove the human, but often we have to think of what humans are actually involved. The larger notion, though, is that in these categories that are being created, they're not necessarily talking to anything that we can share. And so there's a possibility for freedom, there's a possibility for liberation, but I find that we're always going to fall into the same trap in the same way that, old computer science talks about garbage in, garbage out. It might be very legible, clean data, but if it's going to be within a capitalist structure, within a structure that privileges white people over others, or in a structure of patriarchy, those things are going to be impossible to weed out. And a really good example of this, I think, is the Taybot controversy of Microsoft a couple of years ago, where they let loose this machine learning, what they called artificial intelligence algorithm, to the world. And so people would converse with it on Twitter. And then eventually it became extraordinarily right-wing, extraordinarily anti-Semitic, extraordinarily racist, praising Hitler, etc. And so people were founded, why is this happening? And a lot of people actually blame 4chan because 4chan took this and they said, actually, we can try to train the algorithm towards, fascist policies. But lost within that was the fact that they were training Taybot not on some sort of, apolitical language set, but they were training it according to U.S. Hollywood movies. So it was talking not according to how people talk, but how Hollywood scriptwriters believe people talk. And if we look at cinema in the U.S., 21st century, again, extraordinarily racist, extraordinarily problematic, extraordinarily often focusing on issues of anti-Semitism or of Nazism or fascism itself. And so even if it didn't have an accent politics of being rightward leaning, that is still the data set had enough words, for example, the N-word, or example, words like Jew or words like Nazi, that it was really easy to tip the scale to push Taybot to say, yeah, that's how people talk. And so any attempt to, I think, make a neutral algorithm will be really, really troubled by this garbage in, garbage out issue. But what it really requires us to do is to think about how we can not just believe the output, but we can think critically about how these outputs operate, what might be the ways that we can counterbalance them, but also what are training data sets that might not be riddled with these really, really problematic assumptions. And it's really hard to find in a big data world a data set that isn't, because our world is quite, messed up. But I do think in the case of, I write about this in I think it's the control chapter in the middle of the book, the case of Google flu, that Google flu quite, I think valiantly tried to figure out how they could understand flu epidemics, not by people actually going to the hospital, but by people searching at the level of the symptom. And so the very kind of publicized notion of Google flu was that it could tell a flu epidemic 6 weeks before the Center for Disease Control knew about a flu epidemic. And instead of waiting for people to go to the hospital saying, I'm sick, you would get people searching for, oh my God, I'm throwing up all the time. This is horrible. Mm-hmm. And there's something really nice about that. And I want to think about that in thinking through the productive or potential liberatory aspects of these algorithms. That it was a good attempt to try to think about how new associations, new pieces of correlation, data correlation, then allow new forms of knowledge to be created. Eventually, Google flu, for many people, failed because it didn't predict accurately the flu epidemics that would happen in 2013, I believe, 100 out of 108 weeks. So it failed most of the time. But at the same time, it's like most of our ideas of the world fail. And so we have to constantly revise them, constantly think about them better. And I think if we want to avoid the asymmetries or discriminations that arise from algorithms, we have to think about them not as one-off, okay, we're going to put this into the wild, but constantly retooling it, constantly assessing it, constantly figuring out how we can maybe change the training data or how we can understand the limits of these systems, and understanding, too, that these systems will always be a little bit problematic, even if we try valiantly for them to be good.
I want to ask you then about sort of the examples that you use. The beginning of each chapter, you have a sort of either a quote or a transcript or something that is really indicative. It just highlights some of the issues that you're discussing in that chapter, which, I mean, makes a lot of sense. For example, in the privacy chapter number 4, you have this call transcript from the British 999 emergency number where somebody was calling in because of a malady that the algorithm that they followed on the line thought wasn't important enough to send an ambulance. Turns out this person died, I think, a few days later, if I recall right. You also have, Microsoft commercial and the way that they're seeing code. And basically, you're choosing really interesting things to highlight the discussion that you're about to have. At the same time, though, for me, as soon as I read the transcript of the emergency call, I thought, this is really horrible, this is upsetting, and very scary. But just to play devil's advocate, I mean, you could probably find a transcript of something that, heart attacks, for example, I know that there's been a lot of work where there's very simple questionnaires that people have been asked in terms of emergency rooms that are supposed to be much more accurate at predicting whether somebody is or is likely to have a heart attack than the average person or the nurse or whoever is talking to the person. And so, perhaps you could show something like that, which seems a lot better in terms of using algorithms for these kinds of services. How did you choose what to include? And I mean, what kind of decisions were you making as you were thinking about that?
Oh, that's fantastic. When you're saying that, I think very quickly, or I go immediately to Larry Page, co-founder of Google, and I have this in the book. He said that if Google was able to have healthcare data, it would probably save 100,000 lives a year. Mm-hmm. And it goes to the point you're saying, which is that you could find out through these data sets how drugs were, interacting in a way that potentially we wouldn't be able to see from first glance or from even a human-centric perspective. And we could save untold amounts of lives. And I really want to to think about that, but not from a proprietary Google form, but how might we understand this from maybe a larger governmental or social lens. And so in terms of the examples, most of them are ways to tell a story. That's going to sound like a hokey answer. But the example, obviously, of the guy dying, it was, for me, a way to think about how all algorithms are going to be a little bit fallible. In the case of this guy named Mark Hemmings, he died even though he told the operator what he had. The response was one, a religious kind of acceptance of algorithmic truth, saying, the algorithm said this, I don't know why it would, say the wrong thing. So an unyielding allegiance to algorithmic outputs. But at the same time, we're seeing a political economic aspect of, reducing money, privatization, a lot of these services, so that there's not really humans who are potentially available to challenge the algorithmic assessment. Even in the example, she said, there are paramedics here who I could talk to, but I doubt that they would tell me anything different. So there's the algorithmic allegiance as well as the neoliberal privatization and the reduction of state money for these systems that I wanted in that story to bring up, because I think if you point out every algorithmic flaw, as you rightly say, that there's always an algorithmic success story. And so rather than say, let's think about this at the level of the algorithm, I think we should think about it at the level of society and how these logics of why should we even have an algorithm, that we can have really good conversations of it, from triage to big data analytics to find correlations of drugs being manhandled or potentially ways to cure cancer that might not necessarily be from an individual doctor research. Fantastic possibility, but if we think about them only on the technological level or even only on the social level, we're always going to be missing the connection between both. And I think that the way that a lot of people focus either on the digital or on the politics or the economics or the social is really a detriment to how we can understand the complexity of our algorithmic worlds.
And I'm also curious in terms of writing and researching. I imagine, how many chapters do you have? Is it 6 chapters, this book?
God, you're asking me. I should know this. I think it's 6 or 7, yeah.
Yeah, if you include the intro and the conclusion, it's 6. You have 4 main chapters. But as I said, in each one you start with something. But I would assume that you've been collecting or at least mentally thinking about, potentially dozens or hundreds of possibilities to use. Do you have a system of, I don't know what you would want to call these, sort of like anecdotes or epilogues or tidbits, whatever that are great for accessing this much broader issue, but sort of saying it in a way that captures a really important aspect, is interesting for the reader, sets up an issue for people to think about. Do you catalog these? Do you keep these? I'm just curious in terms of how you collect and maybe think about this as you're doing work over the years.
I have hundreds, because obviously there's new algorithms every day.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that most algorithms often are the same thing. Very, very famously, people have noted that the same algorithm that can understand facial recognition for an Amazon package at a doorstep might be the same algorithm that people use for drone attacks in Yemen. And so a lot of the things are just, you shake it up and it's a different association of things, but it's nonetheless the same structure. In terms of examples, I'm always interested in, to go back to the storytelling piece, I'm always interested in what is the most persuasive story. And so through that, part of the actual winnowing out process of which examples to use was telling them to friends or family or even just students or other colleagues and seeing how their ears or eyes perk up when, like, oh my God, somebody died because of this, or oh my God, I didn't know that happened, or yeah, I heard about that on NPR. And you get to gauge how people operate and how they pay attention to things. I even begin the book with something that I found. It's just a Washington Post opinion piece by this guy who's a former Bush administration official who noticed that Google had a celebrity algorithm. Mm-hmm. So I begin the book because a lot of on this question of, are you famous? And so you can say yes or no, but the ultimate ideal that I'm trying to promote in the book is that who you think you are is not necessarily who you really are in line. And so somebody like Rihanna Google thinks that Rihanna is a celebrity. And so because of that, Rihanna as a person doesn't have the ability to take away, based on the right to be forgotten in the EU, take away search results because of unfairness or the things that people think are not supposed to be on the search result. But Robin Fenty, which is Rihanna's real name, isn't famous. So Robin Fenty doesn't have the ability to right to be forgotten, but Rihanna doesn't. And so that origin form for me was really interesting, not because necessarily I care about fame, but because a lot of how we understand identity comes from celebrity, or comes from how we think about what people have called the star power. So media representations, who is the ideal type of masculinity or femininity. That all of those things for me was a really good way of intersecting not just, the technological form of, oh my God, they can find a famous person through an algorithm, but how those ideas of fame can actually have, century-old theoretical workings that suggest it's not just technology, but it is just how we've understand identity throughout history. the idea for me then again is storytelling, but storytelling that can address several different layers at the same time. Because going back to your earlier question about technology, so many books are written on this stuff that I do think that the best books are, hopefully, thinking about mine, can address these things on multiple levels. So even if the technology changes or becomes a little bit outdated, the arguments still pass muster and the book is still interesting.
Well, and that's exactly one of the main issues with writing about technology, is that the technologies might change. They're guaranteed to change faster than the publishing industry in terms of researching, writing, and eventually getting a book published. How closely do you try to stick to something that's new, like in the last, few years or something? Or do you even think about that? Or are you simply thinking about a good example of perhaps an algorithm that will, in whatever guise, continue to keep coming back to us in our societies? What's your relationship with like the idea of being new as you're working on this, especially considering that in this case, you're working on a book that's probably going to take a few years?
Yeah. My method was what I call like a cross-stitch approach or patchwork approach, because I didn't want to rely on a single example because, as you say, they get outdated quite quickly. I think that when you study algorithms, at the end of the day, the facial recognition algorithms that people are using are, decades old. And so what happens is they improve in some way. But I talk about an algorithm in 2009 that wasn't able to identify a black man called Desi Cryer, but was able to identify a white woman named Wanda Zaman. Mm-hmm. And so obviously the video is very, very, very funny, but also really troubling at the same time, called HP Computers is Racist. In the video, they explicitly show the white supremacist logics of algorithmic processing in the HP Media Smart Computer. But in 2009, immediately after, HP was able to reconfigure the algorithm and make it so it was able to recognize multiple hues of skin color instead of just, very light-skinned people or people with a frontlet in front of a computer. There's always that ability for algorithms to on-the-fly change or, update themselves so they're not as improper. I know Sophia Noble in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, ran into this a lot because often Google search results change based on, things, especially autocomplete, especially when Google is critiqued for being sexist or racist. What they're going to do is they're going to very quickly go in to say, no, it never actually existed. You're wrong, blah, blah, blah. And so she was actually attacked by a lot of engineers saying, well, my search results don't show what your search results mean. And so I think from a very limited and narrow-minded perspective, people don't understand how algorithms change. I think part of the persuasiveness is to show several different examples of these things, fully knowing that they might be archaic or outdated in empirical form, but that the logics themselves can be traced over and over and over and over. And so part for me of thinking about examples is to say, well, you might have an algorithm from the turn of the century that is really, really, really problematic. But if you can find an example of 2018 of that same logic, but in a different company or in a different instance, that it allows for a much stronger argument or persuasion of the fact that these things are still with us and can't just be X'd out. And I know Google does this a lot. An example in my book of how a certain set of words in Portuguese was translated to the N-word in English. And after somebody wrote, a woman named Melissa Mormon, she wrote in Africa as a country blog about this experience she had with Portuguese and English. Somebody at Google found out about it. So they did a very quick, if-then response to then change the algorithm. So it didn't produce the N-word in that single instance. But if you change, and I found out if you change a couple of the words around it, it actually produces the N-word just in a different form. So it's not that they actually reconfigured how words are operating within the Google Translate feature. They just found that in single instance and tried to patch it. And I think that's indicative of how a lot of these structures work, because they don't want to rewrite the entire structure. They just want to put Band-Aids over the really problematic holes and hope nobody else notices that around the bandage is often similar, cuts and bruises of injustice, but nobody has found them yet. Mm-hmm. And so, good for me, good method would be to not just have a one-off thing of like, look how horrible this one example is, but to string it through to find out all of the ways that the new knowledges of the world don't adequately represent us, or if they do represent us, they represent us quite problematically and quite unjustly.
And that's really helpful, I'm sure, not just for me, but anyone working with contemporary technology, thinking about demonstrating or thinking through the underlying logic, but also engaging with contemporary examples to highlight that. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's why just now, after reading so many books about data and algorithms, I'm hesitant to pick up any new ones. But then when I do, I can quickly tell, I suppose that's what I'm looking for, although I wasn't thinking that at the time. Yeah, is an underlying logic being assessed and critiqued in a way that's useful beyond the immediate example, I think is a great indicator of a good technology book versus one that's clearly not going to be worth reading a few months or few years down the road. I'm curious about who you use in terms of making sense of this underlying logic and these ideas, because you kind of have a wide array of scholars, of people in different industries. You have sort of critical theory people, philosophers, contemporary internet entrepreneurs, legal scholars. Maybe first you could say, like, do you have a body of work that you're familiar with, from graduate school or what have you, and then you start to apply it? Or do you have something like, let's say, this HP algorithm that can't identify black faces, and then you start to try to look for ways of understanding that? How do you make sense of these issues that you're talking about, considering the wide range of scholarship that you could consult?
Yeah, I think it's an annoying answer would be it's a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
I come from a communications department. I'm in an American studies department now. The books I read are often not digital in focus. So if they do touch it, it's very, it grazes the text. It doesn't necessarily center itself. For me, a lot of this text I'm using then are not necessarily then from that canon. What does the question that I'm trying to think about require me to address? And so part of the HP computers is racist algorithm or example comes from me thinking, well, how do I understand this from not just a technological form, but from a racial form? And so I delve into Fanon and theories of especially Afro-pessimism and that kind of ontological impossibility of non-whiteness becoming human. And so thinking about all of the projects that are critiquing the idea of liberal humanism, critiquing the idea of especially white supremacy, and how we can connect these seemingly disparate fields of, for example, Afro-pessimism and technology discourse, but that they're very, very, very in connection, but just it has to be spelled out because people are using the wrong words and putting them in air quotes, even though they can't see me. Simone Brown does an excellent job of this in her concept digital epidermalization, and she tries to structure an argument that thinks in her world of surveillance, especially of blackness in the digital form, and how that just reifies the post-colonial logics of what Fanon calls epidermalization, or being through somebody else's eyes. That's a very useful way of poetically seeing how biometric technology sees us. We are always on somebody else's terms. And so in my work, it's not just cameras that are seeing us, it's algorithms and assumptions of algorithms. So we're always being with somebody else's interpretation of us on their terms, in their world, in their correlationist statistical forms. And so the suturing of different bodies of work actually, was a result from having to deal with these questions that required interdisciplinarity. And I think a lot of going back to the books that I think could be a little bit better are books that only focus and have their foot in one field. I hope it doesn't sound arrogant, but it's to sound that the most compelling work for me, are introducing me to scholars or ways of thinking that I wouldn't have thought connected, but nonetheless are really useful in helping understand the implications, not just as a technological failure or success, but how this might reverberate or how this might be thought of historically.
I think for me, the impressive thing, but also the sort of intimidating thing when it comes to writing is how do you start to put things together without being too much of a sort of jumble of ideas, which I think it could easily become. Because, for example, if you're dealing with, let's call it an engineering problem, I think what HP would probably call, to some extent, an engineering problem. And then maybe what you're doing, and I'd like to know more about that, but maybe I could see you saying like, okay, well, what's the sort of philosophical lens through which we could look at this? Or maybe what's the sort of gender theory that would help us understand this, or post-colonial critical race theories? Is that how you sort of do it? Or do you try to do it as sort of wide as you can, bringing in more than one lens? Because like you said, interdisciplinary studies, for example, is really interesting, but also really difficult. For one, you need to be well-versed in more than one discipline, but also you need to sort of carefully select and choose, or else it looks like, I guess you're just hitting all the marks. It can seem very surface level.
Or just a assemblage of different parenthetical citations that don't necessarily have any internal cohesion, but look really impressive.
Exactly, yeah. You could just hit the critical race, gender theory, postmodern philosophy, whatever, and just go quickly, but you definitely don't do that. I'm not sure how you do it.
No, that's it. And actually, it's one of the most kind of aggravating things, I think, is, you see this on even Twitter, but you see this in especially contemporary politicians as well. Folks just saying race, class, gender a bunch and then loses its appeal. This has obviously been the case since the 1970s. But you do some sort of hand-wringing, oh, look at that, I'm dealing with gender or race or class. But at the end of the day, that doesn't have that structural approach that would require, you actually deal from the ground up these very important theories or critics of excellent society. maybe this is a defense of the humanities. I think that part of the engineering problem that you're talking about is, and this is for me one of the fascinating things about Silicon Valley, is that they're very much embedded in a notion of how sociology works and how humanity should operate and what is good politics versus what is bad politics. They're just able to hide it because they don't have to actually express about I believe X or I believe Y, or for example, I fetishize the individual over the collective. Obviously, those things and currents extend within Silicon Valley's culture, but don't actually get called out. And so part of, for me, what a lot of these humanistic critiques are, they state their claims quite directly. And in stating their claims directly, they're able to then, I think, be useful in a persuasive way. So it's not tacked on at the end, but it's actually the origin form by which we understand the phenomenon we're addressing. How might different bodies experience this in different ways? How might the training data and algorithmics produce this exact method in how we understand how does data get collected? How does it get cleaned up? How does it get put into the model? And eventually, how does it get spit out? But those first three steps become more or less how the knowledge of that data set gets interpreted. And so in the same way, we think of, who is in power right now? Well, we could think of that as, well, they deserve it. Or we could do the, good anti-capitalist or anti-state critique and think of how power blocks get formed, or do the good feminist critique and understand masculine power as it existed over centuries, or do the good anti-white supremacist, logics of thinking of how different bodies have been assessed and valued and seen and whatever. I guess interdisciplinarity might be the bad word. It might actually be a refocusing on the humanities to think more productively about these questions so you don't take for granted all of the assumptions that the Silicon Valley people are making, but instead at every level of every step of every technology, you're kind of pushing it at the place where you think it's weakest. And for me, a lot of the critical race and critical gender studies work allows me to find that Achilles heel of most technological projects quite readily, because as we see, women and people of color in technological form are often the most poorly treated, or just the most people who are not necessarily represented in Silicon Valley. I don't know if that answered your question explicitly, but the idea for me is to think more as maybe as the defense of the humanities, not in the let's read some books ways, but think about how humanistic theory has actually given us extraordinary tools to answer these questions, that we don't have to necessarily know the exact algorithmics, but we can surmise from, what we understand about white supremacy that, that algorithm is probably going to be racist.
We could talk forever about this because it's such a difficult, complex idea of integrating these kinds of ideas in a way that's productive. But the Achilles heel idea sounds interesting to me, just the way you would phrase that. Is there something that stands out to you, or maybe an example or something? Because you could, I'm thinking, sort of like a Derridian deference. You can continually just keep breaking things down and then never get anywhere almost, because in order to understand one thing, you have to question the presumptions about the thing before it. But the Achilles heel I like as a metaphor because, so as you said, you go towards sort of the weakest thing to deconstruct, if you want to call it that, or to think through, question premises. What does an Achilles heel look like? How can you recognize that? And perhaps it's different in each situation, but how do you focus in on an Achilles heel in whatever issue you're dealing with?
Yeah. Okay, I guess the best example in my mind right now is thinking about having debates with students. A lot of students, we have something called Digital Studies at the University of Michigan, which is this critical interpretation of what the digital is from a lot of different perspectives, disciplines, departments. And so we have these really, really, really rich groups of students from every different vantage who are coming to address questions of, for example, the politics of code. And so we talk about how algorithms might assign different people identities or personalization algorithms. And a lot of students don't necessarily have issue with it. And so there's this very famous example a couple of years ago, 2014, that Facebook did that they called the emotional contagion experiment. And people maybe are familiar with this, but more or less what they did is they took 100,000 different users and they, without telling them, they changed their newsfeed. And so half of the 100,000 got positive news feeds. And they tried to see if you showed people positive content, would they post more positive messages in their status updates? And they did the exact same thing for, quote, negative expression. So if they ignore negative stuff, would the people post negative? And they actually found in their analysis, it was done often without consent, obviously without consent, they actually could produce an effect of positive or negative emotions. And I told this to my students, and they were very interested. They're like, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. But for me, I was like, okay, well, how do they actually do that? And you go to a couple of the papers about this experiment, and you found out that they used this dictionary called the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count Dictionary, which more or less just takes about 5,000 different words and assigns them about 30-some different categorizations. So a word like happy is positive, they argue. But you see words that are a little bit more ambiguous hungry. Is hungry a negative word or is it a positive word? Like, I'm really hungry and eager to go eat. So that sentence has a negative word that potentially is about positivity or about suggesting that there's something to be done about it. That the idea of how Facebook was trying to understand the complexity of emotion is that they were really just doing a very simple arithmetic of like happy +1 or hungry -1. And then seeing, well, is this a +1 or -1?
Yeah.
Or is it a plus or minus sentence? And then you're happy or you're sad. And so the complexities of language often then were not represented. And so we see all of these claims being made. And so for me, I was thinking, well, look at the training data and you can actually download this LIWC dictionary and look at how they address it. And I have a screenshot of that in my book. And so you're not actually addressing that is this wrong or is this right? But what you're doing is you're seeing that part of the aberrations or the misidentifications come from the fact that no real data piece can accurately, I mean, this is the problem with communication itself, that you can never actually accurately understand 100% what somebody else is saying. You're always bringing your own lens to somebody. When you talk to me, I'm trying to assess best I can, but nonetheless, I'm not going to get it perfectly. And so that same relationship can be drilled down over and over and over when you think about algorithms, you think about data. And so for me, that's been a really useful way because I can create extraordinarily, quote, sexual assessments of a sentence based on, I think I have in the book, like George W. Bush's or George H.W. Bush's presidential address was seen to be extraordinarily sexual because he used words that could be conceived to be sexual, but obviously a presidential address is not going to be sexual. And so the idea is then of saying that there's knowledge that's being produced, but is this knowledge verifiable? Is it useful? Is it true? There's always going to be, well, it could be, but really what I want students and I want people who maybe read the book is that you can't just trust it because it's an algorithm, that you have to understand all the complexities that go in. And so the Achilles heel for me would be the sense that we think language means something, which obviously, I mean, quoting Derrida himself, that language doesn't necessarily mean what it says it is.
Yeah, no, that was a great example. And actually, I'm glad you said that you had a screenshot because I wanted to ask you about that. And I'm just curious, for any scholars, was that an issue? Like, I'm not sure, and I'm not asking necessarily for legal advice here, but how was it finding these figures or capturing them from your screen and asking them to be in the book and getting them in the book? Did you have to get any permission for that, or have you found that it's mostly fair use?
I firmly believe in fair use. Before I was interested in algorithms, I was interested in I did research on fair use. And so I'm a big proponent, and I do think that all of the images in my book are very just fair use pieces. I do remember when I had earlier work on similar arguments, and I was trying to get actual authentication from especially private companies to say, yes, you can use this screenshot, or you can use this white paper image. And obviously they would say no, because they don't want it outside their hands. And I found that very limiting. Critical takes of technology, obviously these companies are not going to want you to have the access to them, but I do think fair use claims, especially now after fair use has actually had practice and people are able to more or less strongly act on it, that the legal case that was for, especially within documentary film, claims to fair use were very, very difficult because there wasn't a set of codes or standard practices. And now that we're developing them, yeah, fair use all the way. I guess that would be the really short answer to your question.
Yeah, I can probably just say that anyone interested in doing this should probably consult with someone with legal expertise. But I am interested because I do maybe it's just me, but I feel like I'm seeing more screenshots of things. And if they are sort of publicly accessible, like a lot of things on the internet, it's hard to say that this is a private thing that shouldn't have been revealed in especially a critical book or something like that.
I think we're also engaging a thing that a lot of these things are visual. As much as we want it desperately just be ones and zeros, that there's an aesthetic dimension, or at least there's some sort of rhetoric that is visual. And so the screenshot, and I could think of a bunch of books from algorithms to just digital culture itself, that screenshots are becoming often necessary because, as we know with the Google search algorithm, these things change, minute to minute. So how can you have an artifact that is not necessarily, permanently screen capped? And it's really difficult.
Yeah, definitely, as you say, for things that are changing like Google search results, even if you're not publishing your findings, it's definitely a good idea to screen capture those things. Well, I mean, it's a really rich book and there's so much that I want to ask you about, but I don't want to take up any more of your time. My last question then, if we are data or we are becoming data and we are therefore having to sort of maybe not reconstruct ourselves from scratch or anything, but to sort of think about how we constitute ourselves and how, perhaps more importantly, businesses are constituting us in these ways. Doing this research, thinking about this, how should we proceed? Because it seems like opting out 100% is virtually impossible. Unless I remember seeing a video of people who are, it's a joke video, maybe you've seen that, of Google offering opt-out centers where they're like hidden in the middle of the woods and you have to like burn all your lively possessions and you get, anyway. It seems like it's very hard to opt out of this in many situations. Perhaps there's certain forms you can fill out and, unsubscribing, but it seems like we are inevitably becoming data. What should we do?
Yeah, well, I think that's really the opt-out thing for me is, I don't know. It seems like some people are living in a different world if you can opt out of everything. And I just take the example of the way to opt out of the thousands of companies that are attracting you is to go to their page and say, I opt out of this. And that just sits on your cookie. So the default is that you opt in. If you ever clear your cookies, the thousands of companies that you diligently went to their sites and said, I do not want to be surveilled, then that's impossible. Similarly, there's hundreds of companies every year that are being created that do the exact same thing. So the idea of this volitional, independent self rationally addressing, yes, I want to read this privacy policy, no, I don't. I think it's archaic, and I think that claims to make an ethical internet or ethical surveillance structure based on informed consent is actually quite ridiculous. And I'm not trying to be crass about that, but I think it's trying to affirm a offline subject on an online world, which is, again, another maybe crass way to interpret it. In terms of how do we move from here, I think that we first should embrace the fact that who we think we are online is not necessarily who we are. And so that has surprising results in terms of if you have a Mac browser, your plane tickets might be more expensive than if you have a PC or other browser or operating system. And those things obviously don't have necessary correlation, but could potentially have input on how your price for a flight works. So to be aware of that is one thing, but I think literacy itself isn't enough. I'm a big proponent of thinking about socializing what Tiziana Terranova calls in her Politics of Network Culture, or her information milieu, is that we're no longer living in a world of identity or representation, but we're living in a world of association and pattern. And so instead of saying I vocally am not X or I am vocally Y, we should think of the only way these algorithms authenticate us and understand us is through how we are patterned according to extant models. So how can we produce signals where we want there to be signals, or how can we produce noise when we want there to be noise? And understanding that it's not just individuals who are doing this, but we could at a collective level institute infrastructures of noise wherein we all download a certain browser program and we all collectively produce enough noise so that no signal can be found and so no identity can be understood. That there's something really nice, and we can think about queer studies that trying to abolish notions of gender, at the same time trying to think about gender equality, that there's something really useful in seeing that there's power in disruption, and it's not about saying, yes, I am X, but about just producing noise to disavow a signal. But also to think of how can we start to craft new identities using this information. These things don't have to be proprietary, secret, and used for capitalist marketing, but they can be used in the case of Google Flu. In the case of really any idea of a kind of a collective or communal way of thinking about big data, that there's potential for finding really interesting associations, affiliations, if we just are able to orient our algorithms away from profit-seeking and towards something more humanistic and equal. Take into account that, we can opt out, but we should understand that we're much more complex than we thought we were, because we all might have a different gender within our algorithmic forms, or we might be understood in an age form that's different. And instead of trying to affirm some sort of authentic self, we should adapt to that and say, maybe there's complexity to who we are, not based on who we think we are, but how people think of us. Yeah.
And I mean, the book highlights in so many different ways just how complex and interwoven we are in a system that we're probably all of us in regardless, but we may not know we're in or to what extent we are in. Yeah, it's a really interesting read, and I really appreciate you talking to me today, John. It's been a real pleasure.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your questions and the time you have yourself.
As always, thank you really very much for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast and for supporting it however you can, whether that's buying some stickers on the website or giving simply a good review on iTunes, Facebook, YouTube, anything that you're accessing it on. Very much appreciated. It's funny, I do realize that in the interview I say data a lot. I was raised by a British speaker and my wife is French, and I realized that those people, I think, say data, and that's where I get it from. Every American I speak to says data, and so I might try to start switching to data, but I don't know, I find that really kind of hard. I don't know what they say in Canada, actually. If anyone knows, if there is a proper way of saying data or data, I'd really love to hear about it. Send me a message or put it on the site. That said, I appreciate everyone who's listening, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Cheers.